Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're doing something a little different. We're basically performing an economic autopsy. We're trying to figure out how a nation with literally the largest oil reserves on the entire planet, a country that was just swimming in money, went completely, utterly broke. Okay, to really get this, let's just start with a crazy contrast. Back in 1950, Venezuela was the fourth richest nation on Earth per person. I mean, think about that. It was twice as rich as Chile, and get this, 12 times richer than China. It was this global magnet for talent, a place people were desperate to get into, not escape from. And today? Well, today, that exact same country is the source of one of the biggest migration crises in the world. We're talking millions of people fleeing, many just on foot. Their currency became so worthless, and I'm not exaggerating here, that people would literally weave it into wallets just to sell the tourists as a souvenir. So yeah, the big question is, how on earth does that happen? So to understand how they fell so far, we've got to go back and look at just how high they climbed. We need to talk about their golden age. This was an empire, but it wasn't built on armies or anything like that. It was built on an endless ocean of oil, of black gold. Finding oil, well, it changed everything for Venezuela, and it happened almost overnight. They went from this quiet agricultural society to a global energy superpower, just like that. By the 1930s, oil wasn't just a part of their economy. I mean, it was the economy. It made up more than 90% of everything they sold to the rest of the world. Fast forward to 1970, and this flood of oil money, these petrodollars, had turned the capital, Caracas, into this dazzling cosmopolitan hub. To put that in perspective, their GDP per person was higher than Spain's, higher than Greece's, even higher than Israel's. Their standard of living was something the rest of the continent could only dream of. So all of this kind of reached a peak in a moment of huge national pride. The government decided to take control of its most precious resource, and they created the state-owned oil giant, PDVSA. And you know what? For a while, it worked incredibly well. It was run just like a top-tier global company, and it ended up being the largest in all of Latin America. But, and there's always a but, right? Hidden underneath all that glitter and all that cash was a really dangerous problem, a structural problem. The very foundation of all that wealth, it had a fatal flaw, baked right into the design from the very beginning. All right, so let's break this down. The first part of this flaw is a classic economic trap. You might have heard of it. It's called the Dutch disease. Here's how it works. All that oil money flooding in made Venezuela's currency super strong. So strong, in fact, that it became way cheaper to just import everything else. Your local farms, your local factories, they just couldn't compete. And so, slowly but surely, they just withered away. And that was problem number one. Problem number two was that Venezuela became what economists call a rentier state. Now, what does that mean? Basically, when a government can pay all its bills just by cashing oil checks, its whole relationship with its citizens changes. It doesn't need to tax them, right? So politics stops being about how to grow the economy, how to make the pie bigger, and it becomes a fight over who gets the biggest slice of the oil pie. When you boil it all down, you see the real problem. The entire national economy was running on this super fragile three-step process: pump oil, sell oil, import everything else. Sure, it created this illusion of wealth, but it was hollow. It was all tied to the crazy, unpredictable price of just one thing. And during that big oil boom in the 70s, the government was just drunk on cash. They weren't just spending what they earned. Oh no. They started borrowing money, betting on a future where oil prices would be high forever. And in just 10 years, the country's debt just exploded. It went from a manageable $2 billion to a mind-boggling $33 billion. And then the music stopped. The party came to a screeching halt. When oil prices finally crashed in the 1980s, the shockwave was seismic. There was this one event they called Viernes Negro, or Black Friday, and it was this massive psychological blow to the nation. All of a sudden, all the corruption and the bad decisions that had been hidden by decades of easy money, it was all laid bare for everyone to see. So, the stage was set for the final act. You could say the country's economic immune system was totally compromised. And what happened next? Well, it wasn't just another mistake. It was the decision. The one catastrophic choice that would make the entire collapse irreversible. Okay, so this is the absolute turning point. After a big national strike, the government, under Chavez, basically decided to get revenge. And in an act of political payback, they fired nearly half of the entire workforce at PDVSA. We're talking 18,000 people. And these weren't just guys on a rig, this was the brain of the company. The seasoned geologists, the brilliant engineers, the managers who actually knew how everything worked. The result? It was immediate, and it was a complete catastrophe. All that expertise was suddenly replaced with political loyalty. The people who knew what they were doing were gone. So crucial maintenance just stopped. And the country's oil production, its very lifeblood, went into a complete nosedive. The crazy thing is, the oil was still in the ground, but the knowledge, the human ability to get it out, that had been deliberately destroyed. So, with the oil money drying up, what does the government do? They turn on the printing presses. They just start printing money. And that unleashed one of the worst cases of hyperinflation we've seen in modern history. We're talking prices doubling every few weeks. It got so bad the government literally had to chop 14 zeros off its currency just so people could buy a loaf of bread without a wheelbarrow full of cash. The sheer scale of this economic implosion, it's honestly hard to wrap your head around. I mean, the economy shrank by about 75%. To give you some perspective, that makes the Great Depression in the United States look like a mild recession. It's just a completely different level of collapse. And of course, this economic freefall had a devastating, tragic human cost. A study backed by the UN found that by 2021, an unbelievable 95% of the population was living in poverty, and more than 3/4 of them were in extreme poverty, meaning they couldn't even afford basic food. And it wasn't just one thing. A whole series of disastrous policies just threw gasoline on the fire. They forced businesses to sell things for less than they cost, which, surprise, led to empty shelves. They just seized private companies, which completely destroyed their ability to produce anything. And then in 2017, the country officially defaulted on its debt. It was cut off from the rest of the world. The billionaire nation was officially, finally bankrupt. And the result of all of this? It's a human tragedy on a scale that is just staggering. Over 7.7 million people have fled the country. Think about that. That is nearly a quarter of the entire population. It's a demographic catastrophe, and it's created one of the largest migration crises anywhere in the world. Okay, so after seeing all this devastating story, what are the lessons here? What can we take away from this cautionary tale? What really, truly is the source of a nation's wealth? Well, if you boil this whole tragedy down, I think it comes down to 3 really powerful lessons. First, just having stuff isn't real wealth. Venezuela inherited all that oil, but true wealth comes from knowing how to manage what you have. Second, your people, your experts, your entrepreneurs, they are way more valuable than anything you can dig out of the ground. And finally, and maybe most importantly, it showed that strong, independent institutions, they're like the invisible operating system of a healthy country. And without them, everything else just falls apart. Look, at the end of the day, the story of Venezuela is just a brutal, sobering lesson. Here's the kicker. The country is still sitting on trillions of dollars of oil. But the nation, the society built on top of that oil, it's gone. And it proves in the most painful way you can imagine that a country can have all the natural resources in the world and still end up completely, utterly ruined.